The wind cut like sharp blades, echoing through the deep valleys of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. The sky, heavy and gray, threatened more snow at any moment, while the ice accumulated on the trees created a frozen, hostile landscape, almost untouched. Animals rarely ventured out of their burrows during the harsh winter, and the solitude that dominated the vast White River National Forest seemed eternal. Among the shadows of the mountains, Colt Mitchell adjusted his bare fur coat, his gaze always alert and experienced. A veteran hunter, Colt knew every inch of that region like the back of his hand. He was a man of few words, more comfortable in the silence of nature than in the company of others. The solitary life in the mountains had shaped his character. Hard as the rock itself, resilient like the winter surrounding him. That morning, as he prepared for another hunt, the radio in the corner of his cabin emitted a strange static. He stopped, his hardened face turning toward the device. The voice of the local ranger sounded muffled, interrupted by interference. Something about suspicious activity in the restricted area of the national forest. And then, silence. Colt frowned. It wasn't common to hear alerts like that, especially during an imminent storm. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a simple trail completely changed your fate? Unbeknownst to him, Colt was about to find out, and he wouldn't be the only one facing the unknown in the mountains that day. Colt Mitchell wasn't just any hunter. Years ago, he had been one of the most respected forest rangers in the region, responsible for protecting the vast wilderness of White River. His connection with the land and its animals was deep, almost instinctive. He understood the behavior of the creatures that lived there, knew how to read the signs of the forest like no one else. But something inside him changed. After an unspoken incident, he left the service and isolated himself in the mountains, living as a solitary hunter. Colt was a man of few words, and rarely did anyone dare ask him about his past. The White River region, especially in winter, was a land of extremes. Snow covered everything in deadly silence, and the temperature dropped to unimaginable levels. Local legends spoke of strange phenomena, unexplainable lights, mysterious disappearances. Colt, a practical man, never paid attention to these stories. To him, it was all just part of the natural cycle of life in the mountains. But the forest had its own secrets, and not all of them were visible. That morning, preparations for the hunt began as usual. Colt checked his traps, adjusted his rifle, and packed his supplies. But something was bothering him. The interruption on the radio was unusual, especially with bad weather approaching. He knew the area mentioned was off-limits, a legally protected zone where no one should be. It was then that he spotted the footprints. In the untouched snow, deep and recent, they led toward the national forest. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. Colt stopped, observing them carefully. There were no vehicle marks, no other signs of movement. Whoever it was, they were on foot and heading into a forbidden area. The veteran hunter knew this wasn't normal. What would you do if you found something completely unexpected in a place where no one was supposed to be? With his rifle in hand and his senses on high alert, Colt decided to follow the footprints. Something was wrong, and he needed to find out what. He followed the footprints for hours. The snow was falling harder, making the terrain treacherous. The silence of the forest was absolute, except for the muffled sound of his own footsteps in the snow. The tracks led him to a place he knew well, an old abandoned mine, forgotten in the middle of the mountain. It was a place the locals avoided, a symbol of the dangers that land held. As he approached the entrance of the mine, he saw something he didn't expect. A dog, thin and trembling from the cold, lay in the snow, almost buried by the storm that was beginning to intensify. Colt crouched down, assessing the animal's condition. Its ribs were visible beneath its dirty and matted fur, and its half-closed eyes showed exhaustion and hunger. It seemed to have been abandoned there. But by whom? And why? The surroundings were hostile. The walls of the mine, dark and covered in ice, seemed to swallow any sound. The wind howled, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. Colt looked up at the sky. What had been a moderate snowfall was now turning into something much more serious. He knew he was in danger. The path back to his cabin would become increasingly difficult as the snow rapidly accumulated. As he looked at the dog, his mind took him back to an accident that had happened years ago, not far from there. A group of unsuspecting tourists had gotten lost in a similar snowstorm, right? And only one survivor was found days later, barely able to speak. Colt, who was still a forest ranger at the time, had been part of the rescue team that searched for them. He never forgot the empty gaze of that survivor, marked by tragedy and despair. Now, standing in front of the mine with the weakened dog at his feet, Colt felt the weight of his decision. He could leave it there and ensure his own safety, or he could try to save it, risking even more in the storm. The snow was falling thicker. Time was running out. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between your own safety and helping someone else? Colt sighed, pulled the dog into his arms, and adjusted his pack on his back. The storm was coming in full force, and he knew that both of their survival depended on his next decisions. The snowstorm crashed down on Colt and the dog with the fury of a wild beast. The wind howled like a lost wolf, whipping the snow against his face and blinding his vision. With each step, the snow piled up to his knees, making progress slow and exhausting. The dog, weak but determined, stayed close by his side, nearly stumbling from the cold and fatigue. The weather was relentless, and Colt knew he wouldn't make it to his cabin anytime soon. The sun had already disappeared behind the thick clouds, and the darkness of night was approaching. He needed to find shelter, and fast. The storm was just beginning. He knew that if they stayed exposed for much longer, neither of them would survive. Then, through the endless white of the snow, Colt spotted a familiar silhouette. An old forest ranger station, abandoned years ago, was partially buried under snow and ice. He had worked there in his early years as a ranger, before the station was decommissioned. It was a safe place, at least enough to shelter from the storm. Dragging himself to the door, he pushed it open with force, and it creaked as it gave way. Inside, the place was just as cold as outside, but at least it offered protection from the wind. He set the dog in a corner, covering it with his jacket, and began searching the place for anything that could help them warm up. The environment was decayed. Cracked walls, old broken furniture, and a fireplace that hadn't seen fire in a long time. As he rummaged through an old supply box, something caught his attention. In the corner of the room, covered by an old blanket, were modern equipment. Colt frowned. It wasn't common to find things like that in an abandoned station. He pulled back the blanket, revealing state-of-the-art lanterns, climbing backpacks, and even a long-range portable radio. Something that modern rangers used in restricted or hard-to-access areas. That equipment hadn't been there when he worked at the station. Someone had been there recently, and judging by the condition of the gear, not long ago. A chill ran down his spine, but it wasn't from the cold. Colt slowly stood up, observing the surroundings more closely. There were boot prints on the wooden floor, recent enough not to have been covered by dust or ice. Whoever had left that equipment behind was up to something they shouldn't be. He moved back to the window, peering outside. The wind whipped against the glass, and there were no signs of life beyond the growing storm. But he knew they weren't alone. The forest, always mysterious, now seemed even more dangerous. Colt grabbed the portable radio and turned it on, hoping to pick up a signal. The familiar static filled the station, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard voices in the distance, but the interference took over again. Someone was in the mountains, and it wasn't by chance. The dog whined softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. Colt knew he was in a situation much more complicated than he had imagined. It wasn't just the storm threatening their lives now. There was something else, something he didn't fully understand yet, but that he felt was drawing closer. What was happening in that forest? And who had left that equipment behind? The storm raged outside, but the real danger was just beginning. The storm outside continued to batter the mountains with an almost supernatural intensity. The hunter, seated next to the makeshift fireplace, watched the dog, who was now more alert, though still weakened. He couldn't shake off the strange equipment he had found. It didn't belong to any ordinary tourist or hunter. Something bigger was happening in those mountains, and he sensed danger approaching. He picked up the radio again, trying to pick up a signal. After a few seconds of static, a weak transmission emerged. Muffled voices discussed the shipment and the operation. He squinted, trying to decipher more details. The transmission abruptly cut off, but not before Colt heard a direct reference to the White River National Forest. A shiver ran down his spine. He knew what that meant. Someone was involved in environmental crimes, likely extracting natural resources illegally, sheltered by the snowstorm and the region's isolation. Suddenly, a deafening roar echoed through the mountains. Colt jumped to his feet, and the dog began barking frantically. He rushed to the door of the station and opened it slightly to take a look. The sight was terrifying. A monumental avalanche was descending from the higher slopes toward the forest. In seconds, tons of snow and ice swept through the area, blocking the only route back to civilization. They were completely cut off. The tension in the air was palpable. Colt looked at the dog, who now seemed to see something beyond what was visible. The animal, despite its weakness, had an unusual determination in its eyes. It was at that moment that Colt noticed something strange on the dog's collar. There was a faded emblem, almost imperceptible. He knelt down and examined it closely. It was an insignia from a search and rescue unit. The dog wasn't just a stray, it had been part of a rescue team in the mountains. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The dog had likely been part of a rescue operation before the storm, abandoned or lost during some mission. But what was it doing so close to the abandoned mine? And why had those responsible for it left it behind? The connection between the animal and the illegal activities began to form in Colt's mind. Perhaps the dog had witnessed something that no one was meant to see. What do you think will happen to Colt and the dog in this extreme situation? As the storm howled outside and the avalanche blocked any escape route, Colt knew his options were limited. He needed to uncover the truth about what was happening. But now, trapped between the snow and the secrets of the mountains, his only ally was the silent loyalty of the dog, who somehow seemed to understand the danger as well as he did. The storm finally began to relent, but the snow piled up around the forest guard post was dense and impassable. Colt, now with the dog by his side, knew there was no easy way out. However, something within him had changed. The solitary hunter he once was, living only for himself and the wild, now found himself with a new responsibility: to protect not just himself but also this dog, who had somehow been pulled into the same whirlwind of dangers and secrets. As they waited for the storm to pass, Colt began to reflect on the mountains he loved so much. The local culture preached respect for the land, and he knew those criminals were destroying what he and so many others had spent their lives defending. The connection to the values of conservation and protection of the Rocky Mountains, something he had left behind in his isolation, now reignited within him. It was no longer just about surviving, it was about seeking justice. With the dog regaining its strength and the discovery of a functional radio, Colt knew that the next step would be to report the illegal operations. But he also knew that the fight wouldn't end there. There was much more to uncover in the depths of that forest. As he stepped out of the post, the dog by his side, Colt looked at the snow-covered mountains and felt that his journey was just beginning. The solitary hunter had transformed into a protector, not just of himself, but of the land he called home. The Rocky Mountains, now covered by a white and silent mantle, seemed to be reborn after the fury of the storm. The cold wind still blew, but without the same intensity. Colt Mitchell, alongside the dog that now faithfully accompanied him, gazed at the horizon. The avalanche had altered the landscape, blocked paths, and revealed secrets that had, until now, been buried deep within the forest. As they walked along the snow-covered trail, Colt felt a new responsibility weighing on his shoulders. The solitary hunter was now a guardian, not just of his own life, but of those mountains and everything they represented. In the distance, the echo of the storm still resonated, a reminder that danger was far from over. He knew that the peace in the mountains was temporary. The web involving environmental crimes and the mystery of the dog was just beginning to unravel. Throughout the night, the storm finally dissipated, leaving a deep silence over the snow-covered mountains. The cold still bit fiercely, but the wind had calmed, and Colt knew the worst was over. He slowly rose, checking the small makeshift shelter he had set up beside the extinguished fireplace. The dog, still weak but with brighter eyes, watched him with silent gratitude. Gently, Colt retrieved a small first aid kit he had found in the station. He began to treat the dog's wounds, applying makeshift bandages to its injured paws and cleaning cuts caused by the ice and the brutal journey. The animal did not resist, as if it understood that Colt was there to help. As he worked, Colt murmured words of encouragement, something he hadn't done in years, talking to any living being other than nature itself. After finishing the bandaging, Colt opened his backpack and took out a piece of jerky and some hunting biscuits. He cut them into smaller pieces and offered them to the dog, which, despite its weakness, devoured the food with desperate hunger. It was a simple gesture, but for Colt, it was a moment filled with symbolism. It wasn't just about feeding the animal, it was about establishing mutual trust between them. With the dog fed and treated, Colt began to plan his next steps. The avalanche had blocked the way back to his cabin, but he knew that, with time, he could dig out an escape route. The radio he had found could still be useful, but more importantly, there was the matter of the modern equipment and the transmissions he had heard. Colt knew he couldn't just leave that behind. In his mind, the transformation was complete. He was no longer the solitary hunter living in isolation, seeking only his own survival. The mountains, his true home, were being exploited and destroyed by those who saw only profit. The dog, now his companion, had been a silent witness to what was happening. Colt could not return to living the same way. Rising to his feet, he looked at the clear blue sky beginning to emerge between the clouds. The snow, though dense, sparkled under the light of dawn. Colt knew the fight was just beginning. He had a mission now, not only to uncover who was behind the environmental crimes, but to protect the Rocky Mountains, the land he loved so dearly, and those who had no voice to defend themselves. With the dog by his side, Colt started down the trail leading to the lower part of the mountain. He knew he would soon find signs of those who had left the equipment at the station. It wouldn't be easy, but Colt was ready. He had spent years observing, studying, and understanding the land. Now, he would use that knowledge not to hunt animals, but to track those who threatened his home. The dog, with the bandages securely wrapped and a full stomach, walked alongside him without hesitation. He was more than just an animal. He was a symbol of the struggle they both faced together. Colt understood that the mountains held more secrets, and he was determined to uncover them, one step at a time. The silence of the mountains after the storm was deep, almost comforting. Colt Mitchell, with the dog by his side, felt the weight of the past few days slowly dissolve in the cold air. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to shine timidly through the heavy snow clouds. The dog, now with its paws bandaged and properly dressed, moved with more vigor. The animal's eyes had regained their sparkle, and the silent gratitude it conveyed to its new companion was palpable. For the first time in a long while, Colt felt responsible for more than just his own survival. They were no longer alone. The portable radio from the forest ranger station had finally picked up a clear signal. A rescue team was on the way, alerted by him about the avalanche and the suspicious activities in the mountains. Colt knew he couldn't face the criminals alone, but at least he had managed to survive the storm and save the dog. As they waited for the team to arrive, Colt reflected on the transformation he had experienced. The solitary hunter, who had once avoided any form of connection, was now a protector, not only of that dog, but also of the mountains and everything they represented. He had found a purpose greater than hunting, the preservation of his land and the fight against those who threatened to destroy it. When he finally heard the distant sound of the rescue helicopter, Colt looked at the dog and smiled. They had won that battle, but he knew others would come. The mountains held their secrets, and he was ready to face them.